When we look at 19th century architecture, we admire its grandeur, but almost never check it with a tape measure. Official science claims that people of that time were actually even a bit shorter than us. However, if we put away the textbooks and start measuring door heights, furniture dimensions, and the weight of industrial tools, the math starts breaking down. We will face a macro world that is physically uncomfortable and hostile for a person of standard height. Our task today is not to seek out mystical giants or secret conspiracies. We will conduct a strict engineering and biomechanical audit. We will test official history with the laws of thermodynamics, anatomy, and harsh archival documents. Ready? Then let's turn on our skeptic's calculator. In the second half of the 19th century, America experienced an explosive railroad boom. Breaking ground for new tracks, workers regularly stumbled upon ancient Native American burial mounds. And here, the information space literally explodes with reports about findings of anomalous human bones. And this was not printed by the tabloid press. In May 1885, the respectable New York Times published a sensational but dry report from Licking County, Ohio. Journalists detailed a stone platform from which skeletons were extracted. The height of the largest one exceeded 8 feet. For the press of that time, this was just remarkable archaeology, not mysticism. Similar reports poured in by the dozens. In January 1899, the Middletown Signal newspaper issued a detailed report on excavations near the giant Miamisburg Mound. 2 workers at a depth of 8 feet stumbled upon remains that, according to precise measurements, belonged to a person standing 8 feet and 1.5 inches tall. The most intriguing detail: the body was found in a sitting position, oriented directly east, among untouched layers of charcoal. Journalists didn't scream about aliens, they simply recorded the physical parameters. But can we trust newspapermen who constantly need loud headlines? The skeptic will say, let's check the government archives. And right here begins a true documentary anomaly. The U.S. Bureau of Ethnology, an official government division of the Smithsonian Institution, regularly published massive volumes of its agents' reports. We open the 12th annual report for the year 1891. The report of Colonel Norris from West Virginia records a dry protocol fact. At a depth of 19 feet, a skeleton measuring 7 feet and 6 inches was discovered. In reports from the state of Illinois, agents also routinely cataloged remains ranging from 7 to 8 feet tall. These are not fairy tales around a campfire. This is an official inventory at the state level. So why are these metrics thrown out of biology textbooks today? The answer lies in a sharp shift in the scientific paradigm at the beginning of the 20th century. The new curator of the Smithsonian Institution, the outstanding anthropologist Aleš Hrdlička, brings strict order. He declares, amateur diggers simply measured bones that over hundreds of years had spread apart in the loose earth. The distance from a shifted skull to the heels could give the illusion of 9 feet of height, and the largest femurs he simply classified as the remains of prehistoric mastodons. Hrdlička created an ironclad logical model that permanently closed the question of giants all at once. But our inner skeptic is obligated to test this model as well. Soil deformation is a great argument, but how does it explain those documented cases where skeletons rested inside solid stone sarcophagi? Or that exact same find from Ohio, where the body was located in a strictly sitting position? Under these conditions, a longitudinal displacement of bones by 2 feet is physically and geometrically impossible. The math simply doesn't add up. To put an end to this, we just need to take these bones and conduct modern radiocarbon dating and osteometry. And here we hit a blank, but absolutely legal wall. The bones are no longer there. And the issue here is not a Masonic conspiracy or secret vaults. Everything is much more prosaic and strict. At the end of the 20th century, the United States passed the strict Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, abbreviated as NAGPRA. This law obligated all national museums to hand over thousands of remains extracted from mounds to Native American tribes for their sacred reburial. Scientists gave away the artifacts. Physical, biological evidence is hidden underground completely legally. Biology has reached a dead end. Therefore, we turn our investigation around and strike the official version with the harsh laws of physics and architecture. Let's look at the grandiose macro-architecture of the 19th century. Whether it is the Winter Palace in cold St. Petersburg, the monumental cathedrals of Europe, or federal buildings in Washington, everywhere we see the exact same frightening standard. Internal working corridors are equipped with doors 12 or even 15 feet high. Official architects explain this with passive ventilation. Tall doors were needed for hot air to circulate through giant halls before the advent of air conditioners. It sounds smart until we start calculating the heat loss. Let's test this ventilation hypothesis during a harsh winter. Building workspaces with 20-foot ceilings and 16-foot doors in regions with brutal frosts is total logistical suicide. Warm air always travels upwards. To heat such colossal volumes with firewood or coal, insane energy expenditures are required. Why would people just over 5 feet tall build a world that physically drains all resources from them simply to heat pure emptiness? The design of these buildings is absolutely unergonomic. It rather resembles an adaptation, as if tiny people moved into an infrastructure built for entirely different scales and capacities. This strange macro scale haunts us not only in stone, but also in daily life. We open antique catalogs of the 19th century and find working chairs with a seat height of 36 inches. That is twice as high as the modern standard. Historians say this was for draftsmen working at high slanted tables. Let's assume so. But why do we massively find armchairs of similar proportions in ordinary waiting rooms and administrative offices? If this world was built for our biomechanics, why is it so desperately huge for us? And this is just the beginning. The most terrifying tension awaits us inside industrial workshops. We move from strange furniture directly to heavy industry. Technical museums carefully preserve solid steel wrenches from the age of steam. Their length reaches a massive 6 feet, and their weight is measured in dozens of pounds. On their metal handles, we can clearly see deep scratches and scuffs, the marks of real, heavy-duty exploitation. Official engineering science easily explains. Maintaining huge bridges and steam locomotives required a monstrous amount of torque. To turn such a nut, mechanics used the laws of physics. They took a long lever and leaned on it with 3 men, or hooked a heavy winch to it. Sounds perfectly logical? Absolutely. But the skeptic will ask an entirely different question. If a basic industrial hand tool is designed so that its simple use requires the simultaneous muscular force of 3 regular men, or a complex system of lifting blocks, it means this tool grossly violates fundamental human biomechanics. The design of any object in our world is always dictated by the physiology of its main operator. A sword handle fits perfectly into a palm. A stair-step strictly matches an average stride. The mass production of extremely heavy hand wrenches creates a powerful logical tension. A persistent feeling arises that during the era of rapid industrialization, we simply tried to maintain mechanisms that were originally calculated for completely different physical strength and other dimensions. And to find the true operators of these mechanisms, we are obligated to turn to the most impartial witness of the 19th century, early photography. In the second half of the 19th century, the technology of capturing images experienced a true historical boom. Within huge archives of old glass negatives and so-called cabinet cards, we regularly find clear photos of people of phenomenal height. They tower over street crowds, pose inside studios, or stand against massive brick walls, whose scale suddenly starts to seem absolutely proportionate to their giant figures. researchers of alternative theories immediately and joyfully declare, here they are, those exact builders of grandiose antique buildings and operators of massive wrenches. But we will not rush to make quick conclusions. Our engineering audit fully demands a ruthless medical examination. We open the archives of famous circuses and anatomical theaters of that entire era. Academic medicine gives these visual phenomena an extremely strict diagnosis: pituitary gigantism and acromegaly. The entertainment industry, especially the commercial empire of showman Phineas Barnum, made huge amounts of money off such unique people. Their studio portraits were printed by the tens of thousands, creating, in a historical perspective, the solid illusion of an entire race of giants existing. But let's take a very close look at the real medical records of these circus stars. People with such severe endocrine disorders possessed incredibly fragile health. They suffered from joint weakness, severe spinal bone deformities, and critical loads placed right on the heart muscle. Physiologically, they were very weak. These people simply could not haul 30-ton granite blocks or forcefully twist steel flanges. Biology ruthlessly destroys the entire myth of circus builders. But our skeptic goes much further. If we honestly admit that these documented giants were merely victims of a severe medical pathology, another much deeper and more intriguing biological question arises. Modern genetics actively uses the term atavism. This is the sudden manifestation in modern individuals of traits from their very distant ancestors. That exact inexplicable spike in the birth rate of people of anomalous height, specifically in the 19th century, massively recorded on glass negatives and in authoritative medical journals, forces us to formulate a bold hypothesis. What if this strange epidemic of gigantism wasn't just a random hormonal glitch? What if a dormant recessive gene triggered this? This could easily be a genetic echo of a bygone macro era, physiologically trying to break right through the population. We are not asserting this as absolute dogma, but this tough question demands an answer.
But what about those old photographs where supposed giants are not posing in circus pavilions, but are captured in working trenches or standing right in a normal street crowd? Here the harsh physics of optics comes into play. To shoot massive construction pits in the 19th century, photographers massively utilized wide-angle lenses. The laws of light refraction are truly unrelenting. A person accidentally standing a few feet closer to the lens visually appears significantly taller on a flat photo than those standing in the background. Add to this the standard industrial practice of heavy cropping. During photo printing, masters often trimmed the edges of glass negatives, completely removing dirt mounds or wooden boxes on which foreground people stood. Optics very easily deceives our naked eye, but it is absolutely powerless to ever deceive material resistance. We categorically cannot write off as a photographic lens distortion the millions of tons of real granite and cast iron that heavily form the industrial landscape of that amazing era. Let's shift our focus from dusty paper archives to actual mega architecture and strongly test it for durability. Let's take the absolute ultimate symbol of America's industrial revolution, the grandiose Brooklyn Bridge. Official historiography proudly declares that the epic construction of this massive giant began in 1870. We are asked to unconditionally believe that ordinary people erected this miracle, using only standard hand tools, horse-drawn power, and very primitive steam winches. But the most terrifying engineering paradoxes are not hidden in the beautiful Gothic towers of the bridge, but deep beneath the dark, freezing water of the East River Strait. The engineering archives of the bridge contain a number that literally makes modern designers' heads spin. The weight of the massive stone towers is a monstrous 200 million pounds. To securely hold such an unimaginable mass, an absolutely solid monolithic foundation is strictly required. And right here, soil mechanics enters into a very harsh conflict with paper history. According to documents, these 200 million pounds of granite were placed squarely on giant caissons built from wood.
ordinary yellow pine. Wooden boxes were simply submerged to the bottom of the river, poured full of concrete, and left down there forever. Marine chemists and materials engineers will easily confirm wood trapped under colossal pressure in an aggressive salty environment is strictly obligated to deform and collapse. The fact that the bridge has successfully stood on pine boards for a century and a half is a physical anomaly that strongly demands an investigation. But the greatest tension is caused by the biomechanics of the construction itself. To dig out hard soil under these wooden caissons, workers descended to a depth of over 70 feet. They toiled heavily inside enclosed pneumatic chambers under absolutely monstrous atmospheric pressure. The human body is basically not designed for such highly aggressive environments. People massively suffered irreversible paralysis and blindness from severe decompression sickness. Even the brilliant chief engineer of the project, Washington Roebling, was forever paralyzed and nearly lost his ability to speak, watching the construction for years from a window through a telescope. We see a grandiose macro object that literally broke and physically destroyed its own creators. The infrastructure turned out to be deadly hostile for our specific biomechanics. And precisely here, our scattered puzzle perfectly begins to form a single, frighteningly logical picture. We look at 16-foot doors inside cold northern palaces, at chairs 36 inches high, at incredibly heavy wrenches, and at bridges that kill their builders simply with their colossal scale alone. Everywhere we record a catastrophic gap between the dimensions of macro architecture and the fragile physiology of the exact people who allegedly designed all this for their personal comfort. The skeptic asks an extremely simple question. Why would brilliant 19th century engineers build a world where it is physically cold, deeply uncomfortable, and deadly dangerous for them to live? A persistent hypothesis arises. Perhaps in the era of steam and steel, we merely tried to roughly adapt to ourselves a surviving mega infrastructure of the past, originally calculated for entirely different capacities. Let's solidify this biomechanical paradox and travel right from the East Coast to the West. Take a look at the grandiose Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, the state of Utah. Official history strictly states, in 1847, a group of exhausted religious refugees arrived in a completely bare desert. Having absolutely no heavy industry, they allegedly somehow managed to erect this cyclopean solid granite megalith. According to papers, millions of tons of hard northern granite were carved in a canyon and brought directly to the site over 40 years. And they did this completely and exclusively using simple wooden wagons and slow ox teams. For any modern logistics engineer, this transport model perfectly sounds like a total mockery of the laws of physics and common sense. Moving millions of tons of stone across extremely rough terrain without hydraulics, railroads, and steam engines is a task that heavily stumps even modern specialists. The carving, perfect polishing, and precise jewelry-like fitting of massive granite blocks demand an incredibly powerful industrial base. The early settlers of Utah simply didn't have it. The skeptic takes a calculator and sees a colossal gap between the scale of the declared result and the absolute primitiveness of the described tools. People with basic hand pickaxes against millions of tons of solid granite. And as often happens during our audit, the most terrifying secrets of this building are hidden not in its towers, but deep underground, right in the foundation itself. In the year 2020, a massive seismic renovation officially began at the Grand Mormon Temple. When modern engineers cracked open the base of the huge megastructure, they froze in absolute astonishment. Instead of the expected classic foundation, they discovered a mysterious trench 85 feet deep. But a true shock heavily awaited the researchers upon opening the historical time capsule left by 19th century builders. Instead of valuable blueprints and documents, it turned out to be completely flooded with hardened solid cement. The papers had turned into an unreadable solid monolith. We once again see a perfectly familiar pattern. As soon as it comes to critical nodes of macro architecture, technical documentation either magically disappears or is physically destroyed. To finally document this engineering anomaly of massive weights and efforts, let's recall one more hero of our deep investigations, Edward Leeds Kalman and his absolutely incredible Coral Castle down in Florida. We are asked to fully believe that an immigrant sick with tuberculosis, whose own weight barely exceeded 100 pounds, managed single-handedly to carve out and perfectly balance 1,100 tons of solid oolite limestone. Official science proudly claims that he used only old rusty car parts and wooden tripods, working completely alone at night. Not a single 100-pound man is capable of manually manipulating 30-ton megaliths, unless he uses fundamentally different laws of physics. The biomechanics of the builder once again catastrophically
Utah,
completely
Florida.
fails to
Different
match the
eras,
massive weight of
entirely
the
different
object.
materials, but the pattern is absolutely perfectly identical. We see megalithic weights, cleanly measured in millions of pounds, strictly requiring macro operators or super technologies. And at the same time, historical models persistently slip us exhausted refugees, sick loners, or people going totally blind in dark caissons as the true builders. The math of human effort does not align with the mass of the final result. An absolutely logical question powerfully arises. What if 19th century people never actually built these colossal objects completely from scratch? What if they, just exactly like ants, simply occupied an empty infrastructure left over from a bygone macro era and desperately tried to somehow adapt it directly for their own modest needs?
This hypothesis of adaptive reuse elegantly completely solves our deep paradoxes. If new settlers arrived in a world where these stone giants already proudly stood, their main task would be simple clearing and repair. And exactly here, we face a truly global urban planning anomaly, the bizarre phenomenon of buried first floors. During a detailed study of the historical center of Paris, Prague, St. Petersburg, or the old cities of America, builders regularly discover full-fledged living floors going incredibly deep underground. We see perfectly full-sized windows and doors, tightly sealed below the modern sidewalk level by 6 or sometimes even 10 feet. Official urban planning explains this with the very boring term cultural layer, or firmly claims that streets were deliberately raised up just to combat thick mud. But let's truly turn on the pure logic of the skeptic. The cultural layer simply doesn't grow by 10 feet in just a couple of centuries, in a perfectly even layer across an entire continent. And raising streets, completely burying your own front entrances and bright windows with dirt, instantly turning first floors into damp cellars, this is total architectural absurdity. The scale of these deep soil deposits forces us to carefully test a harsh geological model. It seems that the 19th century world was heavily recovering from a massive mud flow, or climatic cataclysm, which literally drowned the lower tiers of macro architecture under many feet of sedimentary rocks. If people with an average height of exactly 5.5 feet simply dug out this world and just moved straight into it, all the puzzle pieces finally fall perfectly right into their designated places. This brilliantly explains exactly why the new owners suddenly found themselves in buildings with colossal ceilings, massive 16-foot door portals, and completely disproportionately high wooden furniture. They didn't design this harsh discomfort, they simply inherited it. They fully cleared out the grandiose star forts, placed their highly primitive cast iron cannons squarely on their bastions, and desperately tried to fit these giant structures right into their very modest logistics. And exactly in the exact same way, they found giant 6-foot steel wrenches down in engine rooms and slowly began to pull them in groups of 3, brutally tearing their backs, strictly because the true macro operators of these massive machines completely disappeared. But merely inheriting a complex macro infrastructure is not enough. One strongly needs to know exactly how to manage it. And exactly right here, we finally approach the most truly grandiose act of fully concealing a massive technological paradox. Remember our deep investigation concerning the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. They seriously tell us that 200 colossal neoclassical palaces of the Grand White City were erected directly on a swamp in just 28 months, using only wood, straw, and highly temporary plaster. This logistical fairy tale sounds incredibly beautiful, right up until we actually open the official archives of their demolition. To tear down these so-called plaster decorations right after the fair, workers brutally had to massively deploy heavy-duty industrial dynamite. Soft plaster and straw absolutely do not require industrial explosives for safe demolition. The heavy use of strong dynamite in Chicago, just exactly like the cement-filled time capsule deep in Utah, strongly points to the dark fact that original foundations and advanced technologies were deliberately being heavily hidden or completely physically destroyed. We clearly see a vast world of massive architectural machines, which hungrily consumed fully 3 times more electricity than the rest of the entire city combined. We easily find huge tools and grand buildings specifically created for an entirely different biomechanics. And we witness how the new industrial era of dirty coal and hot steam literally aggressively blows up and ruthlessly purges this grand legacy, sadly leaving us with only classic facades and old blurry photographs of very unusually tall people. We have successfully preserved the cold stones, but we have forever lost their original operating instruction manual. The brutal destruction of the majestic White City in Chicago is absolutely not just the routine demolition of old fair pavilions. It is a massive physical symbol of a truly grandiose global technological transition. The 19th century powerfully became the grand arena for a very brutal clash of 2 completely different paradigms. On the first side stands the completely silent macro-architecture of the forgotten past, proudly created with an absolutely unbelievable margin of structural safety and massive spatial volume. Right on the exact opposite side heavily stands the new, incredibly dirty and harsh era of hot steam, black coal, and extremely heavy cast iron. The rising industrialists absolutely did not originally create these huge stone megaliths straight from total scratch. They merely very roughly completely repurposed them. They forcefully shoved heavily smoking steam boilers straight into grand halls with 15-foot ceilings and slowly began to eagerly use the truly giant star forts simply as highly banal storage warehouses for black gunpowder. And this utterly blatant and massive discrepancy between original form and newly assigned function painfully cuts the trained eye of any modern engineer. If we fully accept the bold hypothesis of a heavily inherited macro infrastructure, we are then strictly obligated to quickly answer the absolute hardest question: where exactly did its true original builders simply vanish to? Where precisely did those exact true macro operators of extremely heavy steel wrenches totally disappear to? And exactly right here, we once again completely return directly back to our original biological model. That very same inexplicably weird massive spike of extreme gigantism right in the late 19th century, so carefully recorded by tight medical archives and the sharp lenses of early photographers, could easily have been the very last gasping breath of a rapidly departing genetics. This was an absolutely classic biological atavism. The deeply dormant recessive gene of the forgotten macro people loudly declared itself for the absolute very last time, right before finally, completely, and irrevocably dissolving directly into the huge, overwhelming mass of a brand new, highly standard humanity. Genetics is an incredibly precise and strictly unrelenting science. If the actual carriers of a highly unique physiological trait are critically extremely few, they are absolutely inevitably rapidly assimilated directly by a vastly more numerous general population. The phenomenally tall people staring straight from those old glass negatives absolutely did not fly away to some other planet, and they were never secretly maliciously destroyed. Their unique genetic bloodline simply quietly faded away, totally dissolved deep into the newer generations, sadly leaving right behind itself only very rare medical anomalies, which highly official science quickly rushed to easily classify just as a completely banal failure of the pituitary gland. The biological species successfully fully adapted directly to entirely new environmental conditions, but the massive stone cities originally built strictly for a completely different biomechanics stubbornly just remained proud them standing, and it is absolutely exactly this wild, massive contrast directly between fragile micro-people and giant macro-cities that successfully spawned the single greatest architectural illusion of our entire modern era. We reverently call this massive illusion today monumental classicism. When a modern person just over 5 feet tall approaches doors 16 feet high, they instinctively experience deep awe. Art historians confidently assure us that absolutely everything was built exactly for the sake of this deep awe, simply to powerfully emphasize the sheer greatness of a massive empire or a wealthy state. But the sharp skeptic clearly understands the psychology of total awe is strictly just a completely accidental side effect. The true original builders were actually not trying to heavily impress anyone at all. For them, these 16-foot doors, truly giant wide steps, and huge wooden chairs with a seat height of exactly 36 inches were simply a completely banal, highly standard ergonomic fit. What is currently a highly frightening, massive greatness for us was once simply incredibly ordinary, everyday living comfort solely for them.
We stubbornly took the heavy tools of the grand macro world and desperately tried to heavily remake this entire planet specifically for ourselves. The final brutal cost of this massive physical adaptation was truly and absolutely completely monstrous. Just remember the giant towers of the Brooklyn Bridge. To securely fix 200 million pounds of hard stone firmly onto wooden caissons, ordinary tiny people descended deep underwater and heavily worked exactly at the absolute incredibly bloody limit of their fragile physiology, rapidly going totally blind from severe decompression sickness. We brutally tore our frail backs, desperately trying to manually budge 30-ton solid blocks of the Coral Castle right down in Florida, or manually transporting millions of tons of hard northern granite deep in the dusty desert of Utah. We literally behaved exactly like tiny children who foolishly climbed straight into the massive cabin of a giant mining excavator and are desperately trying to fully control it, heavily throwing themselves onto the extremely stiff metal levers with absolutely all of their tiny body weight. And merely to successfully totally hide this incredibly embarrassing physical weakness, we simply sat down and wrote a brand new, highly heroic fictional history.
The highly official historiography of the 19th century truly pulled off an absolutely brilliant magic trick. It successfully took the hard facts of our absolutely incredible, wildly exhausting manual labor in heavily adapting the old world, and easily passed them right off as undisputed facts of its unconditional, total creation entirely from absolute scratch. They happily tell us straight from early childhood, you are incredibly great builders. You single-handedly erected these massive star forts and grand antique palaces merely with the very simple help of basic hand pickaxes, slow ox teams, and highly primitive steam winches. And they simply quietly flooded absolutely all the glaring logistical and harsh mathematical inconsistencies with a very thick, heavy layer of liquid cement, exactly like inside the time capsule of the Mormon temple, or neatly hid them deeply inside the extremely dry official reports of the Smithsonian Institution. And this brilliant historical magic trick ultimately worked absolutely flawlessly, entirely because it incredibly heavily flatters our collective human ego. It is vastly more pleasant to truly believe that we are strictly the absolute undeniable crown of all biological creation than to finally admit to simply being just highly modest, tiny heirs of a completely forgotten macro era. But the incredibly harsh physical evidence completely turned out to be vastly too massively heavy to ever be easily hidden straight under a small rug. They stubbornly remained lying directly in the absolute most prominent, easily visible place. They loudly creak squarely under the massive weight of those wooden pine foundations, deep in the dark icy waters of the East River. They silently stare right directly at us, straight from the heavily yellowed paper pages of the New York Times newspaper, exclusively from the year 1885. They quietly gather thick dust tightly in the clear form of 400-pound forged iron wrenches strictly displayed inside old industrial museums, and they peacefully lie buried very deep inside the dark earth, highly securely and absolutely completely legally heavily protected directly from our metal tape measures and optical microscopes, specifically by the NAGPRA repatriation law. Each single entirely isolated historical oddity can theoretically easily be completely explained simply by pure random chance or a basic optical illusion of a curved lens. But when we systematically compile them absolutely all together straight into a single data table, the statistical probability of a simple random coincidence instantly rapidly approaches absolute mathematical zero. A true, properly armed skeptic is absolutely not strictly obligated to blindly believe directly in highly beautiful fairy tales concerning mystical giants. A true skeptic is strictly heavily obligated to unconditionally blindly trust only the absolute basic laws of rigid physics, pure mathematics, and harsh material resistance. And when they seriously actively tell us that a wooden pine board can somehow effortlessly hold literally millions of tons of solid granite right on top of itself strictly for centuries, we absolutely do not foolishly nod our heads, but instead we immediately sharply grab a calculator. When they proudly visibly show us a large administrative building with truly colossal winter heat losses and confidently assure us that this is exactly the absolute pinnacle of high engineering thought exclusively for a freezing cold climate, we loudly ask highly uncomfortable questions. Our main task directly on this specific channel is absolutely not to completely ruthlessly destroy official science, but simply to strongly forcefully make it actually work totally honestly. The highly complex history of the advanced technologies of the grand industrial era strictly severely demands a massive global entirely independent comprehensive review, completely absolutely free straight from dusty old academic dogmas and highly convenient cozy compromises. Today, exactly right, directly before us, safely lie two fundamentally, utterly different pictures of the human past. The very first is incredibly cozy and deeply comfortably familiar. In it, there are absolutely zero giant macro operators. Absolutely all old blurry photographs are simply a basic optical lens defect, and absolutely ordinary tiny people happily built giant massive buildings purely out of a deep burning love for fine art, completely utterly disregarding the absolutely monstrous energy costs. The exact second picture is incredibly harsh, freezing cold, and deeply highly engineering. It strongly firmly assumes that we currently live strictly in a massively inherited infrastructure, whose true original biomechanics was forever entirely completely lost, sadly leaving us absolutely nothing but a fading genetic echo and massive solid artifacts, vastly totally disproportionate strictly to our very fragile physiology. And this specific exact second rigid model, no matter how utterly intensely highly paradoxical it directly verbally sounds, is entirely mathematically and practically logistically vastly, much more firmly solid and highly sustainable. Exactly which of these two specific versions to finally fully confidently accept directly as the absolute fundamental truth is completely and strictly up entirely just to you. But right before heavily making any completely absolute final concrete conclusions, simply go and properly conduct your very own strict personal experiment. Firmly put aside the thick paper history textbook, quickly grab a standard metal construction tape measure, and exactly, directly, strictly measure the vertical height of the large doors, right in an old historic administrative building, sitting exactly in your very own home city. Exactly fully calculate mathematically just exactly how much dry firewood or heavy black coal is strictly needed to properly completely physically heat it straight through the freezing winter. Closely look directly at the truly massive heavy hand tools locked inside the city museum and absolutely honestly firmly ask exactly yourself, Could you realistically actually physically fully work with them strictly for literally even just one single whole day? Eagerly strictly share your exact personal engineering calculations and deep thoughtful thoughts right down directly in the video comments. The digital algorithms absolutely do not like such heavily uncomfortable, difficult questions, so your direct active viewing support is critically, incredibly highly important right now. Quickly, strictly, absolutely subscribe directly to the active channel. Instantly, firmly turn on all push notifications, and let's strictly all together continuously, deeply keep testing our official human history strictly for structural durability. See you completely, entirely, safely soon, directly, exactly right in the very next deep investigation.